Okay, well, I guess we are online now. Let me first say hello, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for coming to this second edition of Constellations of the Ordinary, second session of this year. This is, as you know, a celebration of Stanley Cavell's life and work. And it's a group of friends that have gotten together. This is one of the features of this colloquium, that we are trying to construct a community of discourse together. That's why we're meeting once every month, so that we have time to sort of metabolize what we're reading and writing. I encourage those of you that participate and are hoping to come back to write your questions, whatever thoughts you might have in the chat, because we will take that as a feedback for our following sessions. As you will see, we have a very eclectic, very diverse group of people that are participating in the next 5 months, and we hope you can join us. I wanted to point out that our banners, the ones you see when you come in, are always going to have a little quote from Stanley. Last week's, I don't know, I forgot to mention it, read, "Looking philosophically, as it were, beneath our feet rather than over our heads." These are little slogans or quotes that are supposed to characterize certain aspects of Cavell's thinking. This week, we have, in particular, let me see if I find it. I thought I had it in front of me. I don't. Do you have it by any chance there, Toro? Yes, the problem, he says, this is a quote that you read at the beginning. "The problem of the critic as of the artist," Cavell writes, "is not to discount the subjectivity, but to include it, not to overcome it in agreement, but to master it in exemplary ways." I want us to keep that in mind, because I think it'll come up in our conversation. In any case, I hope to do so. While Toro is speaking, Toro will be our first speaker. I would encourage you to write your questions or whatever thoughts in the chat space, and we will take that into consideration. We are going to proceed in this way. For those of you that are just coming, we're gonna have Toro speak for 30 minutes. Then Stephen Affield is going to speak for another 30 minutes. Then we're opening the discussion for panelists that are with us, and then we will open it for the general public. In the meantime, we will be collecting your questions. So please do write them on the chat. All right. Well, so I guess I'm sorry for the delays here.
Victor, I'm sorry. Are we directing those questions to the entire conference, or just to someone in particular?
You can direct them either to the entire conference, or else to myself, to Victor Krebs. Either way, it works. Okay, so we're starting now. It is my great pleasure to introduce Toro Moy from Duke University, who will be reading her paper, or not reading, or reading parts of the paper, right? Called "A Wittgensteinian Phenomenology of Criticism." And Toro, you have the word. Welcome.
Thank you. So I'm Toro. My paper is called Wittgensteinian Phenomenology of Criticism. It continues work that I did, it continues the work that I did when I was, sorry, I actually have to stop here. Suddenly my screens went full screen and I can no longer see my manuscript. Well, I luckily have it in my hand, so we'll do it like so. So this continues work that I did in Revolution of the Ordinary. And in this paper, I'll ask whether there can be such a thing as a Wittgensteinian literary criticism. But even before that project can get off the ground, it runs into an obstacle, namely Wittgenstein's own famous give up literary criticism. As the distinguished British literary critic F.R. Leavis tells the story, one day around 1930, Wittgenstein came up to him and said, without any kind of preamble, "Give up literary criticism." Grievously offended, Leavis wanted to retort, "Give up philosophy, Wittgenstein," but he held his tongue. Did Wittgenstein mean to say that literary criticism is a worthless intellectual pursuit? Leavis certainly thought he did, but Wittgenstein was equally hard on philosophy. He himself gave up philosophy in 1920 and only returned to it in 1929 when he realized that he had new compelling questions to answer. He also regularly told his students to give up academic philosophy. One such student was Maurice O'Connor Drury, known as Con, who writes that Wittgenstein constantly urged his pupils not to take up academic posts and become teachers of philosophy. Taking this to heart, Drury trained as a psychiatrist, but he insists Wittgenstein never advised anyone to give up philosophy if by that is meant thinking about first principles and ultimate problems. When I said goodbye to him for the last time at Cambridge, and we both knew he didn't have long to live, he said to me with great seriousness, "Drury, whatever becomes of you, don't stop thinking." Wittgenstein's advice to give up philosophy embodies a strong critique of academia and an equally strong sense of personal and existential seriousness. If you have no burning questions, you shouldn't be doing philosophy at all. Since Wittgenstein detested most academic philosophy, he would probably have detested most academic literary criticism too. The real question arising from his give up literary criticism is whether literary criticism can be existentially serious, expressive of genuine thinking, and also committed to Wittgenstein's hallmark philosophical struggle against the bewitchment of our understanding by the resources of our language. So the question then is, can there be a Wittgensteinian literary criticism? Now, this is the short version of my paper, which I seriously hope will clock in at 30 minutes. So the short version of a longer discussion is it's by no means clear. There are all kinds of reasons why one might want to give up that project, like imposing a theory, laying down requirements for what the literary critic should do, all of which would be against Wittgenstein's own ethos, but I won't go into the reasons why not. I will just say that these questions about whether there can be such a thing as a Wittgensteinian literary criticism, and if so, whether that is the sort of thing that can be taught, these questions have puzzled me for years. This essay is an attempt to reach a greater measure of clarity about them. But how do we begin with this? Wittgenstein would certainly advise me to give up the craving for generality and focus instead on examples. We remember that Wittgenstein says that an example is not in principle more ambiguous or certainly not less illuminating than a theory or a definition. And an example has the great advantage that it doesn't have to represent anything, doesn't have to stand for a class of similar cases. It's just a particular case that invites reflection and analysis. And here, next slide, siguiente, por favor. The point of working with an example is to invite dialogue. For if you can't see what I say I see in the text, the next step must be to discuss the matter, to try to get clear on whether we imagine the case at hand differently and what our respective views overlook and what they entail. Disagreement is not disconfirming. It's as much a datum for philosophizing as agreement is, Cavell notes. And Cavell's great teacher, J.L. Austin, also relishes disagreement. A disagreement as to what we should say is not to be shied off, but to be pounced upon, for the explanation of it can hardly fail to be illuminating. I should say that it seems to me that a good disagreement can be just as philosophically clarifying as some kind of harmonious agreement. I take that to be an implication. But here I just want to say that an analysis, a description of a particular case, the example, can only ever be an invitation to look and see, to consider whether or how far you can see what I see in that particular case. Just as I stake my subjectivity in my claims, you will stake yours. You test my claims against your own convictions, perceptions, and experiences. Sometimes you convince me, sometimes I convince you. But even when we can't find common ground, it doesn't follow that nothing has been achieved. The investigation itself will still have been illuminating. And the best examples are those that inspire more thought, the ones that turn out to be good to think with. I think here we go to siguiente, por favor. The next slide. I'm going to be brief on this, but the key problem then, if we're going to work with examples, is to figure out what our problem is. We turn to the example in response to a problem. And in my experience, at least in literary studies, to figure out what I'm actually doing, why am I fascinated by this, is the hardest thing. And the ensuing investigation is not supposed to lead to an explanation, but to a description. And this description, Wittgenstein says, gets its light, that is to say, its purpose from the philosophical problems. So if we had no problem, if we don't, then the investigation will be empty, because it will have no purpose. We're just messing about with an example, but it's not leading us out of our confusions, to put it that way. And that's the hardest possible work. So here, siguiente, por favor. So then, obviously, I now need to choose a question. And when it comes to the question of choose an example, I meant. So when it comes to the question of Wittgenstein and literary criticism, one example imposes itself, namely Stanley Cavell's pioneering essay, The Avoidance of Love, a reading of King Lear. This was first published in 1969. Siguiente, por favor. I will use it as my example simply because it fills me with the sense that this isn't a case of what we might call Wittgensteinian writing about literature, then nothing is. I can't imagine anything that's more an example of this thing that I want to investigate, namely, can there be such a thing as Wittgensteinian literary criticism? So what makes Cavell's reading of King Lear Wittgensteinian? Well, it certainly can't be its overt appeals to Wittgenstein's authority, for the essay rarely mentions his name and contains only one explicit reference to a passage in Philosophical Investigations, namely paragraph 133, which turns up in a discussion of where and why and how to bring an interpretation to a close. So what kind of questions does Cavell ask? What are his problems? The subtitle of The Avoidance of Love is a reading of King Lear. Cavell uses the term reading to signal that he thinks of literary criticism as the attempt to get clear on problems arising in our encounter with the text. And that's already crucial, to get clear on problems arising in our encounter with the text. The investigation will take the form of a description, which, if successful, will make the problem disappear. Siguiente, por favor. In fact, Cavell begins not by going straight to King Lear, he doesn't begin by diving straight into the text. He begins by a discussion of character. He asks, what, if anything, grounds the belief, widespread among literary theorists at the time, and still today, I think, that there is a conflict between character criticism and verbal analysis. Now, this is something that I wrote more about, both my own views and Cavell's views on character, in this book that I co-published with Rita Felsky and Amanda Anderson. So the question then is, after discussing character, Cavell then goes on to show quite brilliantly, oh no, I mean, not after, during, in the course of, why he disagrees with the critical dogma that declares that we must never treat characters as if they were real people. In this paper that is in this book, Character, I do go back and try to find the first instances of this belief and try to analyze how it came about and what's the huge problems attached to it are. So, siguiente, por favor. So the key, first, Cavell goes into 9 critical questions about King Lear. Cavell's views on what is going on in King Lear are, to my mind, supremely convincing, but they are not my topic here today. My topic is, what is he doing as a literary critic? So he begins by posing these 9 classic problems about King Lear, which I will not go into. And the first part of the essay is a straightforward effort to provide answers, like, for example, how are we to understand Lear's motivation in the opening scene? So that's the first part 1 of his essay. But already in the introduction, he gives clear notice that his inquiry won't end there, for he also intends to raise a new metacritical question, namely, why is it, if what I say is correct, that critics have failed to see it? This is, to my mind, such a deep question for anyone struggling to read a text, and it's crucial for this paper that I'm giving here now. So you come up with your answers to what you think is going on in King Lear. And then, well, if I can see it, why haven't anyone seen it before is Cavell's question. And that leads to part 2 of the essay, which is really focused on the question of why it is so difficult to see the obvious. And in this part 2, he is using all his previous work in part 1 to figure out what is it that gives us conviction in our own claims. So an intrinsic part of Cavell's project is to figure out something about the status of claims in literary criticism and about the nature of critical disagreement. In this essay, then, I will show that the avoidance of love fundamentally asks what grounds the critic's conviction in her own claims, and that Cavell's answer to that question takes the form of what I want to call a phenomenology of criticism, a study of what we actually do and perceive in reading, in encountering the text. There's more to say about the word phenomenology, but I'm not going to go into that here. I think that, hang on, I think I have, yeah, right. Just a second. Yes, siguiente, por favor. Yeah. As I worked through the avoidance of love, I began to realize that Cavell describes the act of criticism as at once personal, existential, and philosophical. For him, criticism is an effort to convey an experience built on the critic's perceptions and judgment, an activity which gives rise to a range of different existential moods and states of consciousness: elation, joy, anxiety, arrogance, vulnerability, and convictions. And the stakes of all this are acknowledgement and responsibility. Siguiente. The key concept, so even those concepts that I just mentioned are super unusual in discussions of literary theory, literary criticism. So one can feel already there that Cavell is onto a whole new way of doing this, of understanding what you do when you do literary criticism. So the key concept in Cavell's Lear essay is acknowledgement. Now, I wrote quite a bit about acknowledgement in Revolution of the Ordinary, and I'm not going to dwell on it here. I'm just going to briefly say that, as is well known, for Cavell, King Lear is a play about the disastrous consequences of turning away from love, because love requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement requires self-revelation. The avoidance of love is also the avoidance of self-knowledge, which is why shame becomes such a crucial motivation for Lear and other key characters. Confronted with the unfolding of the tragedy, the task of the critic and the theatre audience is to resist the temptation to turn away, to remain, and rather to remain fully present to the plight of the characters, to make them other and face them, as Cavell puts it. This is the first step towards acknowledgement, to recognize that other people are separate from us and that their expressions of pain require our response. Acknowledgement is Cavell's, not Wittgenstein's, term. Siguiente. The concept arises out of Cavell's efforts to work out the implications of Wittgenstein's remark about of philosophy for the so-called problem of the other. Of course, that leads to his investigations of skepticism and a lot more. But to get to this acknowledgement point, he builds on Wittgenstein's remarks about the pain of others, about pain as something we attribute to a living body. And when he writes in part 2 of Philosophical Investigations, where Wittgenstein writes, the human body is the best picture of the human soul, Cavell responds, the crucified human body is our best picture of the unacknowledged human soul. Siguiente, por favor. It's allergy time here in North Carolina. In the avoidance of love, acknowledgement is something a subject does. Since our actions and expressions necessarily reveal us, who we are, how we see the plight of others, acknowledgement is also self-revelation. Acknowledgement is response, the attempt to see how it is with the other and to express what we see. It requires us to do something truly difficult, namely direct our undivided attention to the other. Acknowledgement, in my opinion, differs from terms such as sympathy and empathy, which I see people often confuse it with, because it's not just a mental or emotional operation or a state of mind. It is expression, action. It requires us to make ourselves present to the other, not just become a distant onlooker, even if that position fills me with a state of empathy or something. Cavell writes, both in the theatre and actuality, people in pain are in our presence. There is no acknowledgement unless we put ourselves in their presence, reveal ourselves to them. So much of the avoidance of love examines self-revelations and the myriad reasons why it's so hard for us to face who we are and what we do. So if acknowledgement is attention and response, and siguiente, por favor, then as a reader, I have to try to understand the work's claims on me. But since acknowledgement is personal, particular, and specific, I now have a double task to understand the work, to acknowledge its concepts and concerns, and to figure out where I stand in relation to it, to get clear on what my own stake in the text might be. And this doesn't have one method attached to it. There is no approach, to put it this way. And here I'm referring to Cavell's way of reading Wittgenstein at the beginning of the Claim of Reason. He says there is no approach. We begin with a blur and a block and so on. One implication of reading a text is, and of Cavell's idea of no approach, is that you can't deal with the text as if it were a physical object. Measuring and weighing it and so on is very good if you're a historian of the book and book production, but it won't help you to do literary criticism. The text is simply not outside me in the same way as a tree is outside me, because the text language is also the medium of my own existence. I'm inside and part of it at the same time as I am trying to think about it. I won't dwell on that here. I will just move on. Siguiente. So how are we then going to acknowledge this text? Here, Cavell's fantastic essay, Aesthetic Problems in Modern Philosophy, says, well, you have to notice something. To notice something is to single out a feature, a metaphor, a genre, a mood, a turn of phrase, or whatever else, and pay attention to it. And Cavell writes in this famous quote, it's essential to making an aesthetic judgment that at some point we be prepared to say in its support, don't you see, don't you hear, don't you dig? The best critic will know the best points, because if you do not see something without explanation, then there is nothing further to discuss. But this feels daunting, and particularly for beginners, because what if you don't feel you're noticing anything? Siguiente. I remember vividly the first time I visited the great art museums in Paris. I was 17, a country girl from the west of Norway. I had never set foot in an art museum at all until I stood there in the middle of the Louvre. My French friends appeared undaunted. They even had things to say about the non-figurative paintings in the Jeu de Paume, where the modernists were at the time, but I grew mute. How was I supposed to be able to say something about works that came to me as UFOs from outside my solar system? Although I looked as carefully as I could, I felt as if I was incapable of actually seeing anything in these paintings. I could find no words. I felt stupid and I agonized over my colossal lack of culture. Back at the University of Bergen, I had exactly the same experience with modernist poetry, which my teachers were experts on. More often than not, this poetry made me feel that I was drowning in a kind of word soup. As with the paintings, I simply didn't know where to begin. But it turned out that I could learn. So let's not forget that to get to the point where one can notice something of critical interest in a text or in a painting or in a work of art is in itself an achievement. And this is what I want to stress here. You don't begin by noticing something interesting. It takes what Wittgenstein always calls training. This is good news. The capacity to notice something can be taught. This is why future critics go to graduate school, to train their eye and ear, to become learned in their field, to understand the wider intellectual debates of their day. When it's done in the right way, the study of theory and philosophy trains the critical imagination by offering new ideas which refine and extend our range of perceptions. Done in the wrong way, it may give students the impression that once they have learned the theory, then the theory will tell her what to look for. That is so relaxing, because then you master the theory and you have your approach. It you won't have to risk yourself and your judgment in the work of criticism. When theory is used as a security blanket in this way, it allows the critic to remain hidden, to avoid the work of acknowledgement, the self-exposure, and the responsibility that comes with it. And obviously, that's the opposite of what Cavell and reading Cavell and Wittgenstein would make us want to do. Siguiente. So some critics want an approach and so on because they appear to yearn for the objectivity of the natural sciences. They have advised their students to avoid the word I. They fear that leaving traces of their own intellectual excitement, dejection, frustration, elation in their writing is somehow vitiating their insights. But why? They forget, such critics forget that in most of the humanities, subjectivity, experience, perceptions are not impediments to knowledge, but rather conditions of possibility for having any knowledge at all. And here I come to the quote that Cavell, we used to introduce this session, namely, the problem of the critic as of the artist is not to discount his subjectivity, but to include it, not to overcome it in agreement, but to master it in exemplary ways. And I want to say, nothing I say here means that you can't write in an impersonal style. It's just a reminder that an impersonal style is also a style. It's a mode of expression chosen by a human subject, and it expresses you just as much as a personal style does. Now, if criticism, yes, siguiente, por favor. If criticism requires the critic to stake her own critical subjectivity in her readings, yeah, here I need the next slide. Siguiente, por favor. Perfect. Then the critic must train her judgment, develop her powers of perception and reflection, and that means she must educate her aesthetic experience to the point that she can trust it. Of course, experience is not infallible. It can lead us astray. We need to go back. We need to check it. We need to train it some more. And I'm very keen to stress that there's no difference here between aesthetic experience and ordinary experience. When the second women's movement started in the 70s, feminists engaged in consciousness racing. It was a training of experience, finding words to put names to experiences that hadn't been understood in the right way before. It was a crash course in the re-education of experience. So all this training and education gets us to the point where we can see something, like in Cavell's, you know, if you see nothing, you have nothing to say about a work. But it takes so much work to get there. Yet it is extremely inspiring work, I have to add. Siguiente, por favor. So I'm going to be very quick towards the end. What I'm now coming to that question, what grounds my convictions? What is this about seeing the obvious? Well, Cavell is so original here. He sets up a series of concepts that we rarely discuss in relation to the work of criticism: melodrama, joy, immodesty, arrogance, conviction, vulnerability. And he says not so much about melodrama here, but about the joy of a major critical insight. He writes well about that. He also writes about the peculiar chagrin arising from the recognition of a critical lapse. Call this the melodrama of the literary critic, from elation to despondence and so on. Siguiente, por favor. So, but what he dwells on are these two terms, arrogance and vulnerability. And anyone who's read a lot of Cavell will see that these are key issues for him in his own writing, I think. So, given given the fundamental role of the critic's subjectivity in the act of criticism, how can we tell whether a critic is right? To find an answer, Cavell sets up a series of concepts that we've already looked about. And then he goes to arrogance. Arrogance is inherent in criticism, he writes. But it's inherent in philosophy too, and in most of the humanities. For what gives the critic or the philosopher the right to say that she sees what we don't, that she, of all people, can bring the world or the work to self-consciousness, as Cavell puts it? This sounds so presumptuous. But what would criticism be if it only told us what we already know? In any case, it's just true that the best critics do see something we haven't seen. They can change our experience of a work forever. I am incapable of watching a performance of King Lear without measuring against Cavell's understanding of the opening scene, for example. Nor can I watch the end without seeing it with Cavell as Lear's second betrayal of Cordelia. Until Cavell showed me how to look at these scenes, I missed their significance. His essay has enriched me, given me the capacity to see more and more deeply than I did before. And that's what great criticism does. So the critic is arrogant because she thinks she's seen something the world needs to know. But this arrogance makes us vulnerable as well. We're arrogant because we can't just let go of our conviction, for it expresses our faith in the rightness of our reading or seeing. But when I do this, I become vulnerable. First of all, I think because my conviction makes me helpless. I simply can't help seeing what I see. Here I stand, I can do no other, I think is Martin Luther's point. But I'm also vulnerable because my conviction may require me to speak up to see if others can come to share my view, which is far from a foregone conclusion. For critical conviction is not grounded in philosophical reason or scientific measurement, but in experience, perception, and judgment. So by sharing what I see, I expose myself to the judgment of others. No wonder that so many literary critics feel overwhelmed by anxiety when they first set out on their path, and that even after writing for years, so many of us continue to feel that tension in the gut as we struggle to express our convictions. Siguiente, por favor. So then this leads Cavell to think about obviousness, because once you've worked hard on a text, you see something, and some of that something will strike you as utterly obvious in the sense that, how did I not see this before? But it's clear, this is what the work is about. Cavell writes, a critical position will finally rest upon calling a claim obvious, and a critical discovery will present itself as the whole truth of a work. He is well aware that these claims come across as ludicrously easy to dismiss, and he has a brilliant response to it, which I won't go into here. But when he says the difficulty of criticism is the difficulty of seeing the obvious, I think that is so true, and it is so original as part of literary theory, because in literary studies, obviousness has simply not been a valued concept. On the contrary, the less obvious, the more brilliant the critic is, apparently. So why does he insist that obviousness is a key problem? And doesn't Cavell come close to contradicting himself when he claims first that he takes himself to have seen something in King Lear that other critics haven't, but at the same time he says, but what I see is obvious, so why haven't other critics seen it? Siguiente. And here I'm going to go briefly over this. Clearly, reading is normally built on evidence and arguments, but the whole edifice rests on some perception, the seeing something. Some claim that you can't just reason your way to. Once you've seen that, you can begin the process of reasoning your way to all kinds of other things, but you have to see something. And that is, this is the heart of Carell's understanding of what we do when we read. You have to stake yourself on some observation, perception. This is what I see. And Carell writes so beautifully about that in Aesthetic Problems. So I'm not going to dwell on that. But what I do want to dwell on a little bit is that I think that Carell's commitment to criticism as the difficult task of seeing the obvious is the most Wittgensteinian aspect of his reading of King Lear. He notes that the whole of Wittgenstein's later philosophy can be thought of as an investigation of obviousness. But the obvious can be hard to find. There's a difference between what seems obvious and what actually is obvious. Intellectual fashions are often the culprits. They make us take dubious claims as unquestioned starting points, make us buy into a theoretical picture of how things must be. For example, what a play is, how to treat or not to treat characters, or what we need a theory of subjectivity for example, with the result that we simply miss what is right before our eyes. To see the obvious, to reach clarity, is really hard. We may have to free ourselves from the pictures that hold us captive. And we do this not by conjuring up unheard of ideas, but by reminding ourselves of what we already know. The work of the philosopher consists in marshalling recollections for a particular purpose. Marshalling recollections used to be translated as assembling reminders. In German, Wittgenstein uses the phrase ein Zusammentragen von Erinnerungen, a gathering of memories, which I think is like so poetic. If a critical confusion is a kind of forgetting, then critical insight is a kind of remembering. And so now I come to my peroration, my end. Siguiente. This is just summarizing what I've already said, and I'm not going to dwell on it. You see it on the slide. We can see that you're driven to your work by a problem. You bring your experience, etc., to bear on it. Once you find out something, you see something, you become both vulnerable and joyful, and of course arrogant, and so on. And all this I have just talked about. Siguiente. So this is a section in my paper, which I am not going to read here because then I would take up all the time. But the question is, of course, what is not a Wittgensteinian reading? And I have some points here, but the key thing that I'm not going to read any of this in this paper, but the idea of, as it were, denying the phenomenological situation, the fact that we're in a world with this text and we stake ourselves in it, is, as it were, the un-Wittgensteinian move. That's the move where you try to deny your, should we say, humanity, encountering the voice of another human and so on, and where you try to make it either objective or following through a theory that you impose it, and you try to mask your own subjectivity. I think all that is part of what I would recognize that not Wittgensteinian. Note, note that here, there isn't the question, sorry. the question is not what theory you read, whether you want to be, if you're interested in Marx or Freud or Foucault, that's just fine. The question is, are you using that to get clear on what strikes you in the work of art? Or are you just thinking, well, Foucault is de rigueur, that's what I must do. That's then you can hide behind Foucault rather than using Foucault to find your own voice. So, siguiente. And this is my last slide. To my mind, nothing creates that unmistakable Wittgensteinian spirit in a piece of literary criticism better than understanding Wittgenstein's later philosophy. But mere knowledge of that philosophy is, of course, no guarantee whatsoever. Wittgenstein, too, can be used in ways that turn his thought into another theory, another approach. I also want to stress that literary criticism inspired by Wittgenstein can be about anything. Ordinary language philosophy is about whatever ordinary language is about. In the same way, criticism inspired by this is about whatever the work is about or what you're interested in language, as it were. And here we're coming to a quote. This thing about ordinary language philosophy is about whatever ordinary language is about. This is a quote that opens up for that alignment between criticism and the work of ordinary language philosophy. In his Lear essay, Cavell explicitly aligned the two. He points out that both practices require the same sort of commitment and interest. In both cases, the problem is to discover what data, what kind of appeals one does in fact find convincing in claims about meaning. By insisting on the similarity between literary criticism and ordinary language philosophy, Cavell draws attention to the work of thinking in literary criticism. I think this is why Cavell uses the term philosophical criticism to describe what he's doing in the Lear essay. He doesn't highlight it, but it is there in the essay. But then this wouldn't be the kind of philosophical criticism that just takes a philosophy and finds examples in literature to illustrate them. So I find that the most Wittgensteinian readings, if I can call them that, are those that recognize this phenomenology of criticism that I have described in this paper. And I find that Cavell does this beautifully in The Avoidance of Love, when he concludes that King Lear is a play about the failure of acknowledgement, the fear of revealing oneself, and the avoidance of the claims of the other. Cavell does not hesitate to say that these are also existential and political problems, but there is more. His insights in what criticism is don't come from the outside. They arise from his effort to read the play. If previous critics have failed to see what he sees in King Lear, he reasons, it's because the same questions also arise for literary critics. What blinds us to the claims of the text? Why do we hide ourselves? Why is it so hard to pay unflinching attention to the particular other in front of us? The phenomenology of criticism is the phenomenology of acknowledgement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toro. Yuri, pues, yeah, perfecto. Okay, well, our next speaker is Stephen Affelt, and he will read this essay entitled The Pertinence of the Stars, Achieving Mortality and Little Did I Know, and Only Angels Have Wings. Stephen, please, you've got the word.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you, Toro. Let me begin by saying it's a pleasure to share the session this afternoon with Toro. Not only because I've been an admirer of her work for a long time, but because she's talking about the phenomenology of criticism, and the paper from which I'll be reading is an exercise of criticism, so it will be interesting it's interesting for me to think about the relations between what she says and what I'm doing. But also, in Toral's paper, one of the emphases is on subjectivity as something that the critic might be tempted to discount. And my essay is about, or a way of thinking about my essay, is that it's about subjectivity as something that can't be taken for granted. We can't take for granted that we possess subjectivity, but it's something that has to be achieved. So hence the subtitle, Achieving Mortality. It would be interesting, I'm interested in thinking about whether that shift in valence is something that would come up in Cavell's work after his turn to moral perfectionism. Anyway, so I begin reading. My paper offers a reading of Stanley Cavell's autobiography, Little Did I Know, and Howard Hawks's 1939 film, Only Angels Have Wings, in terms of each other, and its structure moves back and forth between the two. Like Toral's, my paper is too long to read in the time that I have, and so rather than trust myself to talk through the paper in 30 minutes, I've created a highly edited version that I think I can read in the time that we have. You can think of what I'll be presenting as an archipelago of excerpts that are connected by slender bridges of words. And given the focus of our session on Cavell, most of the excerpts that I will read focus on Cavell's texts, and the bridges are mostly descriptions of and bare assertions about the film. In their remarkable reading of The World Viewed, William Rothman and Marion Keene argue that, quote, apart from the roles movies played in Cavell's education, it would not have been possible for him to have accomplished those feats of philosophical imagination called The World Viewed, Pursuits of Happiness, and Contesting Tears, or for that matter, Must We Mean What We Say, The Claim of Reason, and all of the other books and essays that comprise this American philosopher's singularly ambitious body of work, end quote. They argue, that is, that Hollywood films were not only as essential in enabling Cavell's work and giving it its distinctive character as, say, his experience of Austin, his reading of Wittgenstein, or his understanding of skepticism, but they were an absolutely indispensable condition for the possibility of the work as a whole. But recognizing the force of this claim highlights a surprising feature of Cavell's autobiography. Namely, in a text that is explicitly presented as an attempt to recount the conditions that shaped the formation of his philosophical voice, film plays almost no role. The single discussion of a film that goes beyond a mere mention occurs only in the penultimate section of the text, where Cavell takes up Howard Hawks's 1939 film, Only Angels Have Wings. Here, too, his turn to the film seems accidental, and his discussion seems almost glancing. However, reading Hawks's film and Cavell's text in light of each other allows us to recognize that Cavell's engagement with the film is much deeper than initial appearances suggest. Indeed, I will argue that through his engagement with Only Angels Have Wings, Cavell not only declares his conviction in the existentially orienting power of Hollywood films and their stars, but reveals the deepest philosophical ambition of Little Did I Know as a whole. I'm now skipping most of a section of a text in which I just describe some of the main plot points of the film Only Angels Have Wings, and I pick up with the final paragraphs of that section. This film occupies a special place within Hawks's criticism, in large part, within Hawks' criticism, in large part because it's seen as epitomizing a purported Hobbesian existential moral vision, celebrating a tough, aloof individualism and insisting upon a kind of autonomy that's best demonstrated in willful defiance of mortality. The flyers in Only Angels Have Wings aren't simply willing to risk their lives if necessary in order to complete an important task. Rather, both literally and symbolically, flying provides the opportunity they seek to defy their mortality in titanic repudiation of human condition. Flying represents a declaration of themselves as unreachable by mortality, as if already on the side of the angels. This kind of existential moral vision is undeniably present in Only Angels Have Wings. Indeed, for most of the film, Jeff Carter, the Cary Grant character, his preeminence among the flyers, and his status as the film's star are presented as functions of his being its purest embodiment. However, watching Only Angels with Little Did I Know in mind helps us to recognize that the film ultimately presents a quite different existential vision. And now I move to a section of the text in which I begin discussing Little Did I Know. Cavell's effort to produce a philosophical autobiography means that Little Did I Know differs from standard autobiographical narratives in at least two important respects. First, it aims to be representative, where, as Cavell tells us, that is not a function of the events of your life, but of, quote, a specific attitude one takes to what happens in the soul, end quote. Hence, while Little Did I Know is occupied with specific details of Cavell's life, it considers and presents those details in the thought that they may illuminate common conditions of human life. Second, and absolutely critically, and this I think is probably my central claim about the book as a whole, one of the central ways in which this autobiographical narrative aspires to be representative is that it does not take either the existence or the identity of its subject as given. On the contrary, these are exactly the matters that the work of telling is to determine and demonstrate. So Cavell's autobiography represents his attempt to achieve his existence, to demonstrate that he exists and who he is. There's no question, of course, that a specific genetically distinct individual came into the world in September of 1926 and lived for 91 years before leaving the world in June of 2018. But facts of that sort don't, in the relevant sense, establish the existence or identity of Stanley Cavell. For as the perfectionist authors Cavell so admired continually remind us, it's all too possible to pass an entire existence without ever coming into your own life. Indeed, in a passage from Self-Reliance that Cavell shows to set the central problem of the essay, Emerson suggests that we seem mostly to imagine or to hope that our existence can be established for us by another, and so had at second hand. Invoking Descartes' cogito, Emerson tells us that man is timid and apologetic. He is no longer upright. He dares not say, I think, I am, but quotes some saint or sage. For Cavell, demonstrating your existence is not, as in Descartes, a matter of proving the existence of a thinking thing or substance, but of showing your assumption of agency, something he often figures as claiming your own voice, maybe in terms of Torrell's paper, establishing your subjectivity. In Little Did I Know, Cavell characterizes the goal of his effort to assume his own agency in ways that may initially seem quite different. On the one hand, he speaks of seeking to achieve his own death. Early in the text, in explaining why he had been unwilling or uninterested to compose a straight narrative of the events of his life, Cavell remarks, this is an extended quote, "Such a narrative strikes me as leading fairly directly to death without clearly enough implying the singularity of this life, in distinction from the singularity of all others, all headed in that direction. So the sound of such a narrative would, I believe, amount to too little help to me or to others." We might ask, help with what? What interests me is to see how what Freud calls the detours on the human path to death, accidents avoided or embraced, strangers taken to heart or neglected, talents imposed or transfigured, malice insufficiently rebuked, love inadequately acknowledged, mark out for me recognizable efforts to achieve my own death. End of quote. On the other hand, Cavell also speaks of his efforts to assume his own agency in terms of achieving birth, choosing a life into which he could be born. So, for example, in describing the stakes he placed on earning exceptional scores on his PhD qualifying exams, Cavell says, another extended quote, "Given what I considered to be my advanced age then, and given that philosophy was to incorporate and transform the crisis of musical expression in my life, I believed fully that to fail to excel at the examination would amount to failure as such. I was no longer asking for admittance, but for confirmation that I had found what I wanted to become of my life, the basis on which I would be able, as Plato and Aristotle both have ways of saying, to choose my next life. The issue for me was not to prove that this further life was better than another, but to prove that it was mine, that I was born to it, that I was born." End of quote. Although framed around opposing poles of human life, these remarks about seeking to achieve his own birth and death express a single ambition for what we might call the achievement of mortality. The quest, that is for a kind and degree of investment in life that will draw him out of the anonymity of open-ended possibility and also the fraudulence of paths that are not his own. Anonymity and fraudulence are two of the central terms that Cavell uses to contrast what he's trying to achieve in achieving his own death or birth. It will root him in and to a determinate, authentic life, and hence grant the prospect of leaving that determinate life, and so dying his own death. I propose that Little Did I Know as a whole aims to be a representative study of what I'm calling the work of achieving mortality. Again, I'm omitting several pages in which I discuss some aspects of this work, but pick up at the final paragraphs of this section in which I describe how that work shapes Cavell's autobiographical text. This quest to achieve mortality, to establish his existence, determines the shape of Little Did I Know. It shapes the content of the narrative and the events and episodes it includes, from what Emerson would call tales of accidents transmuted into fatalities, for example, accidents of birth and parentage, ethnicity, geography, but also accidents of an injured ear, being younger than classmates, and so on, to the recounting of pivotal moments and turning points in his life, for example, realizing his father's hatred of him, moving from the house shared by the extended family, leading a high school band, being the only white member of an otherwise black jazz band, leaving music and finding philosophy, becoming a father, encountering Austin, and so on. And this effort to achieve mortality shapes where the narrative can end, in particular with the completion of the claim of reason, since only then did he know that his life of philosophical writing had genuinely begun and could continue. And even more crucially, the quest to achieve his mortality shapes the form of the text, a double-layered structure in which Cavell's tales of past episodes of his life are housed within dated, contemporaneous philosophical reflection on and from those episodes, and also on and from the activity of recounting them. This structure allows Cavell to recount what he sees as the path to his life in philosophy, while simultaneously exemplifying that characteristic philosophical life. It allows him to show his continuing investments in that life and the ways in which it continues to sustain him. This writing, in this form, with all that it tells of his life and with all of its, quote, immeasurable and specific ignorance, end quote, of that life, is what Cavell can offer as demonstration of his existence. It is what he can offer, and all that he can offer, in answer to his own late question, have I become the one who has done all and only what I have done, accepted what I have done as no better and no worse than it is? The next section of my paper returns to Only Angels Have Wings and sketches a way of thinking about that film informed by what I've said about achieving mortality in Little Did I Know. And once again, I'm going to skip most all of that section, but I will just say this. In an influential reading of the film, the critic Gerald Mast argues that the film is an exploration of tensions between, quote, indomitable, courageous defiance of one's mortality, end quote, represented by Jeff Carter, and, quote, warm, compassionate human feeling and sympathy, end quote, represented by the female lead Bonnie Lee, played by Jean Arthur, and that the central narrative issue of the film is how Bonnie comes to accept Jeff's life and by implication share it with him. On Mast's reading of the film, Bonnie's acceptance of Jeff's life ratifies the existential moral vision of indomitable, courageous defiance of mortality. Contrary to Mast, I argue that the film shows that the central issue of the film is actually not Bonnie coming to accept Jeff's life, but Jeff coming to accept his own life and invest himself in it. And that this acceptance and investment is figured in Jeff's coming to commit himself to Bonnie. So the dynamic is basically exactly the reverse of what Mast suggests. And it's not just that it's the reverse, it's happening at a deeper level. Jeff is coming to accept his life, and his acceptance is emblematized in his commitment to Bonnie. As such, I argue that the film is not ratifying the purported Hawksian moral vision of willful defiance of mortality, but critiquing that vision. By showing Jeff's move from a life, quote, based purely on the immediacy and ephemerality of the present, unquote, to his grounding himself in his life, the film moves from an existential moral vision celebrating defiance of mortality to a vision calling for what I've called the work of achieving mortality. So with that left at the level of just bare assertion, I now return to the final section of my paper, which I will read more or less in full, which returns to little did I know. We're now in a position to appreciate the force of Cavell's direct engagement with only angels in Little Did I Know. I mentioned at the outset that his engagement can seem glancing and relatively inconsequential. He initially invites the impression that he turns to the film simply because he happened to find it on late-night television during a bout of insomnia. Further, after he first mentions the film, which he calls quite good, but self-evidently not up to the work of its principal actors, writer, or director, he turns away from it and directs his attention for several pages to the Hawks-Furthman film of To Have and Have Not, and more generally to what he calls, quote, Hemingway's issue that the ability to stake one's existence confers the right to existence, end quote. An issue that is clearly central to Only Angels, although Cavell does not make the link explicit. However, when he turns back to Only Angels, he makes clear that he was led to it not by the accidents of television programming, but by a remark that stopped him while reading Blanchot's The Writing of the Disaster. Quote, the Hawks-Furthman Only Angels Have Wings came to mind, Cavell tells us, out of Blanchot writing, now quoting Blanchot, the inexperience of dying as someone who has not learned how, or who has missed his classes, end quote. Having been called to mind in this way, the scant 2 paragraphs that Cavell devotes to the film focus entirely on a single scene, the scene of the death of Kid Dab, played by Thomas Mitchell, a favorite member of the group of flyers, and his final exchange with Jeff. This is an extraordinarily rich scene which I can't take the time to describe here, and Kid's death is a pivotal moment in the film and in Jeff Carter's transformation. However, in order to recognize the extraordinary weight Cavell gives this scene and the role his discussion of it plays within Little Did I Know, we need to see how he builds to it and how he quite openly and yet all but invisibly enacts it in the final pages of his text. So this is one of these moments that Toril was talking about where something seems obvious to me and a reading is built around that, and then there's a question, why, if it's obvious, is it not seen? If it's not seen, maybe everyone has seen it and I just haven't discovered that. Throughout the final main part of Little Did I Know, Cavell is led by his reading of Blanchot to reconsider, as if one final time, questions of human and philosophical orientation and disorientation, how we may understand our being lost, and how we may find or recover our bearings in life and in thought. Blanchot inspires this reconsideration due to his conviction in the ubiquity of human disorientation. Early in the writing of The Disaster, Cavell tells us, Blanchot, quote, opts etymologically, hence metaphysically, for the significance of disaster as marking our being dissociated or disengaged or disconnected from the pertinence of the stars. Hence, Cavell goes on, for Blanchot, disaster is revealed metaphysically to be, or to have become, the normal state of human existence, marked by the release from our ties to the stars, end quote. Cavell, of course, finds deep affinities with the thought that disaster, understood as disorientation, is the normal human condition, or that, as he would put it, the human is constitutionally subject to becoming lost. However, which I might gloss here, becoming lost in the sense of failing to be a self. However, while Blanchot seems to associate this disorientation with a loss of our connection to or conviction in transcendent points of guidance, Cavell follows Wittgenstein and Emerson in seeing our disorientation as a function precisely of our quest for the transcendent, the unconditioned, and our skeptical repudiation of the ordinary or everyday conditions of sense. It is a function of what he calls the human drive to deny or escape the human. Glossing Wittgenstein's claim that his work consists in returning words from their metaphysical to their everyday use, Cavell remarks that an implication of this claim is, quote, that we live in exile from our words, turned from them, from the implications of our lives, strangers to ourselves, or rather, since finding ourselves strange might be liberating, shunning ourselves, starless. He goes on to point out that a symptom of our being lost to ourselves is that we seek a transcendental rescue in or from our words. Among the various human motivations for this disorienting repudiation of the ordinary, of our exiling ourselves from our life and words, and so failing to achieve our lives, in these late pages of Little Did I Know, Cavell focuses on what he calls a horror of understanding, and the sense that to resign ourselves to the human conditions of sense is to be constrained, pinned, or forced to know what cannot be borne. Cavell considers horrors connected with our understanding of others, fears that we may be impaled upon or paralyzed by our knowledge of their suffering, whether they be as near as a desperate and enraged father or as distant as anonymous strangers. And he considers horrors connected with our being misunderstood by others, and so struggling to avoid being hemmed in by the pictures they may form of us. But for my present purposes here, the most relevant knowledge that can seem unbearable is a form of self-knowledge. It's the knowledge of our Emersonian representativeness, of our standing for humanity. To face the knowledge of our human representativeness is to acknowledge that we are always essentially more than any of our particular self-realizations. Being creatures of language, we are essentially creatures of possibility, always and essentially open to what Emerson calls a further, as yet unattained but attainable self. Of course, possibility and its call for continual but uncertain becoming has its own torments. But what can seem especially unbearable in this knowledge of representativeness is its other face, the knowledge that in order to be anything at all, we must embrace determination, become, at least for a time, one thing rather than another. Staking our lives, choosing some path, comes at the cost of foreclosing other paths and relinquishing what can seem our open possibility. But to fail to stake our lives is to languish in mere possibility. However, that such knowledge can be born, and how its demands can be managed, is demonstrated by Little Did I Know as a whole, and Cavell's late invocation of the Grant character. I'm going to be saying Grant now rather than Jeff because that's how Cavell will speak of him. Of the Grant character epitomizes the essential importance of taking it on. Cavell isolates the moment when Grant stands alone outside the room in which Kidd lays dying. This moment, just after taking leave of the mortally wounded Kidd, and just before his fateful exchanges with Bonnie, gives us Grant in the moment of his transformational decision to accept his life and invest himself in it. A few pages earlier, Cavell had recalled Emerson's injunction to, quote, hitch your wagon to a star, and emphasized its call to let ourselves be oriented by the draw of our attraction to stars. Now he offers us this image of Grant as such an orienting star, trading on, but also radically deepening, the familiar Hollywood idiom for its most alluring or compelling actors. He offers us this image of Grant, that is, as an exemplar of the turn away from false transcendence and a consequent refusal of investment in the ordinary, and of the turn toward taking on the work of achieving mortality. It is such an exemplar, such an orienting star, Cavell suggests, that might draw us out of our disorientation. Speaking of this moment, Cavell says, quote, we can read nothing in this moment from Grant's extraordinary face, except the unimpeded demand it imposes upon us from a time and place always beyond us, end quote. Cavell's highlighting of this image of Grant as an exemplar and orienting star provides an essential key to appreciating the philosophical stakes of the vignette with which he chooses to close Little Did I Know. That vignette describes Cavell's conversation with his elderly father at his hospital bedside following surgery to implant a pacemaker. Cavell's father, in effect, implores him to have everyone leave the room and to let him face his fate. Quote, why are the doctors and nurses and family running in and out of my room as if it's an emergency? What's the emergency? If a child is seriously ill, it's an emergency. To run in and out of a room because an 83-year-old man may die is not an emergency. It's ugly to behave this way. Tell them to stop it. End quote. To this last request or demand, Cavell tells us that he replied, quote, that's not my job. Then adding that he was about to say he would tell the doctor about their talk, but his father had fallen asleep. Cavell ends his autobiography with this sentence. These sentences. His position appeared awkward to me. I went to find my mother. Of course, the Freudian family romance and how it was enacted in Cavell's relations with his mother and father has been under exploration throughout the text. And it's also true that Cavell, hearkening back to Thoreau's invocations of the mother and father tongue, has used the image of reconciling his mother and father to characterize his aspiration to produce writing that brings together the literary and the philosophical. Even so, these final words can seem painfully awkward and deeply obscure, and neither the awkwardness nor the obscurity is relieved by considering that they appear in the midst of pages considering awkwardness, the awkwardness of dying, and the closely linked awkwardness of philosophizing in the assumption of representativeness, and so with nothing but the common to tell. How can this, we may wonder, constitute the close of Cavell's effort to recount the conditions of his life? The answer that I propose depends upon recognizing that this vignette closely resembles the scene with Kidd and Grant that Cavell has just considered. As in the scene from the film, this vignette depicts a bedside conversation about death and the wish to be left to face it alone. It includes a kind of leave-taking of the man facing death, and it invites us to imagine Cavell, like Grant, standing alone outside the room he's just left, preparing to go in search of the woman who has always represented the world of life, culture, and the affirmation of desire. This closing vignette then forges an identification between Cavell and Grant, and through this identification offers us an epitomizing image for the work of Little Did I Know as a whole. To present Cavell, or rather to present his own depicted life as an orienting exemplar of the work of achieving mortality. To the extent that we allow ourselves to be drawn by our attraction to these exemplars, we retain or recover our connection to the pertinence of the stars and avoid disaster. It's a mark of Cavell's conviction in the power of Hollywood cinema, and equally of his entrustment to the ordinary, that the stars he offers us for orientation are not in the lifeless depths of space, but shining before us on Hollywood's silver screen and in the pages of the book we hold. But given our human drive to deny the human, the presence of these stars before us may make them harder to recognize as points of orientation. It's often easier to lament the absence of an unseen God than to heed the demanding appeal of the luminously mortal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you both for such wonderful presentations. We are running short of time, but I think it's been worth it. I would like for those of you that already have your hands up. So I'm going to start. I'm going to start with the ones I see in the order I see them. Nicholas, Byron, and William. Bill, please. Nicholas, your volume is muted. Yuri, los volúmenes. Yuri, los volúmenes no los pueden mutar. Yeah, can you do it now? No?
Okay.
No, okay, good.
Yeah, now it's working. All right. Yeah, well, thank you a lot. My question, I gather, kind of mainly concerns Steve's paper or presentation, but of course connects to Tori's also. Well, I gather I'm going to be a little bit kind of arrogant in the criticism term, and my question is just, I mean, because I watched the movie yesterday night, and I'm going to kind of report the obviousness that I kind of reacted to, and I think I appreciate Stephen's the way you phrased it, that you said that Jeff's acceptance of his own mortality comes through by, or as a part of his accepting of Bonnie. Now I think that's, I mean, somehow I can kind of agree with that, but then, I mean, the things I mean, I have a hard time not seeing them as kind of central. That it seems to me that that one of the main parts is that the first part is somehow that there's the way in which Bonnie is here needed, for how Geoff needs Bonnie for his own, as it were, project to find his own mortality is already, I mean, that's kind of the way I want to frame it now. And I mean, one of the most striking things is that you see, of course, that there's, maybe you see this kind of, that there's a certain acceptance of mortality, or kind of going into life, as you said. But then on the other hand, I think it seems to be quite obvious that Geoff will not in any way need to change. I mean, he goes off in the end of the film, he goes off to fly with only one hand, together with the other crippled guy also. So there's no, you don't get the sense that anything needs to be changed. And on the other hand, you get this feeling, or I get this feeling that well, who needs to change? There's a certain kind of that Bonnie needs to be, as it were, in a certain sense, offered, or her own subjectivity. She appears in the movie very independent, self-confident, playing along, but then somehow she is transformed through her love to Geoffrey, which seems to be a very phantasmatic characterization of this woman that would somehow first be very self-confident, then suddenly she just falls completely in love, goes and loses all her self-confidence, her own subjectivity, you could even say, in many ways. So it seems to be that she must, in a certain sense, be offered for him, in order for him to accept to have this project of finding his mortality. So the kind of other side of that narrative seems to be that there's this that Bonnie must learn to offer herself for the project, for Geoff's projects of finding his own mortality. Now, so my question is basically that this seems to me very obvious. I mean, I have a hard time not seeing this as part of the of this narrative. And then the question would be, well, how would you react? And also, why did Cavell not see this, which I think is there? And so that would be kind of so that somehow that there's this project of offering somehow, or sacrificing, sorry, I'm using the wrong term, yeah. Swedish term, this is sacrificing. So Bonnie has to be sacrificed, her own subjectivity in certain ways has to be sacrificed. So the other somehow needs to be sacrificed for this project, let us call it this male project or whatever. So this would be my question or comment. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your comments, which I think are very. Whoop. Oh, am I muted? No. Okay. Those are excellent comments, and I especially appreciate your emphasizing Bonnie's independence and her strength as a character. Because I see there are a lot of people with hands up, and there's already a lot of stuff in the chat. So this is something, this would be a long discussion of the film, which we could have. I would say, I want to say just a couple things quickly. First, and this might just be, I really appreciate people speaking in English when that's not their first language. For me, it's very important that the issue isn't accepting mortality, achieving mortality. Achieving mortality is, we're all going to die, but that's a very different matter than accepting or than achieving our mortality, stepping into our lives. I disagree with your claim that there's nothing changed in Geoff because he goes off flying at the end. There is something changed, which is that he has now committed himself to something. He has now invested himself in something that he can lose, and that he's now said, one of the things he says over and over, and the women say, both women he's been involved with say over, I know you'd never ask any woman to do anything. He has asked someone to do something. He's invited someone else to make a commitment based on his commitment. Those are material conditions, significant conditions that have changed in his life. I don't see reason that we need to think of Bonnie's love for Geoff as somehow involving the sacrifice of her subjectivity, any more than we see Geoff's love of her as him sacrificing his subjectivity. What is true is that she loves a person who is involved in dangerous pursuits, as she loved her father, who we remember was a trapeze artist. So this is something we'd have to discuss. What is it that's leading you to see her as somehow sacrificing herself for his project. That's and I don't want to deny it out of hand. That's a version of sort of a more familiar way of reading the film that I'm trying to argue against. But we can't have that conversation now. I'd be happy to continue it with you, in private.
Good. There are going to be some questions that are going to be left in the chat that we will make sure that you get a response later if we don't have time now for them. So I'm going to do the following. I'm going to call two people so that both of them can ask their questions before we have an answer, so that we can gain some time. So Bill Day goes first, and then Byron Davies, please. Bill. You are muted. You are muted. Can you, Yuri, William Day no puede abrir su micrófono. Por favor, déjalos a todos que abran sus micrófonos. ¿Ya?
Ya está, pueden activar sus micros.
Okay, please go ahead with Bill. You can do it now. All right.
Here we are. Hi, Toril. Hi, Stephen. Like Nancy and Avner, Stephen and I are colleagues in the same department, and I've already had an opportunity to thank him for what I enjoyed about his paper and to raise some questions about it. So my question has to do primarily with Toril's paper. And first of all, I want to thank her for drawing us to that aspect of the reading of King Lear. If I think about the essay, I think about what he has to say about Lear. I haven't thought as much about the kind of what Toril calls metacritical remarks there. And when I wrote a piece some years ago on the politics of interpretation essay, I wish I had gone back and looked at this and sort of seen how he moves from those early essays to thinking about criticism later on. But I have two questions about, it's on pages 19 and 20 for those that have Toril's paper. The first one has to do with this distinction between obviousness, which we've been talking about, and certainty. She points out that he says that to dismiss critical remarks is to take a claim to obviousness as a claim to certainty. And Toril, you say that certainty isn't something that the humanities can aspire to. And you talk about a kind of standard of knowledge tied to the sciences or to a godlike perspective. So I guess two doubts that I have about that. One, I don't think the sciences are what you want for what you're thinking of by absolute certainty. I've gotten the Pfizer vaccine. It's 95% certain that I'm not going to get COVID, but that's not what you're calling absolute certainty. But I think the more important point is that certainty is actually something that is relevant in thinking about critical claims. And Cavell recognizes that. I'm not sure if he would say this later on, but if you remember that moment, and you mentioned part 4 of the claim of reason, at one point when he's talking about the aspect seeing remarks, he says, here's one thing I know without being able to prove. And then he gives a reading. He says that the ending of Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls is a remembrance of, what does he say? Alludes to or remembers the Song of Roland. The final scene in For Whom the Bell Tolls is reminiscent of Roland's death. And he says of that's something that, to get his language, no one of the reasons for why I might be reticent to say this need be that I'm unsure of my knowledge. In the present case, I'm not. And then on the next page, somebody might say, but why call it knowledge? I mean, the thing about empirical knowledge is that it's a fact of the world. Does that mean that you would have to give up all of your other senses about what's true about the world, that this is a desk in front of me and so on, if you were to give up that? And he says, well, but that's the way that I feel about this reading of For Whom the Bell Tolls. So I think you don't want to say that certainty is some other kind of higher standard that literary criticism doesn't go to, but rather that when we talk about certainty, or I'm absolutely certain of this reading, we're talking about a different kind of, obviously, critical certainty is a different kind of certainty. It might be important too that what he's talking about there is not something like the obviousness of his reading of the characters in King Lear. I don't know that he would say it's obvious, this connection between Song of Roland and For Whom the Bell Tolls. He says later on that he's less sure about his reading Stendhal's Le Rouge et le Noir as suggesting the colors on a roulette wheel, right? He's not going to commit to that. Again, obviousness might be a different kind of standard here. And then quickly,
yeah, sorry, I think I understand what you're saying. And if I interrupt you, it's because I think we fundamentally agree. I could certainly have expanded a bit in that paragraph, but essentially what I'm saying, remember what you call certainty in that the Song of Roland example, I would call conviction. I mean, I write a lot about the absolute conviction a literary critic will feel that they are right. And when I use the word certainty in that one paragraph, this is a very shorthand reference to knowing and acknowledging, where Cavell places the word certainty in the epistemological register. So if you talk about certainty, you're bringing up the ghost of skepticism. I think and I could very well have paused in this paper and said, here I'm using certainty in this way, but I am not saying that you can't have utter conviction in what you're saying, but I am shifting the ground from, with certainty, you end up with a kind of epistemological debate, which I think you can't win except by giving in to skepticism. Whereas what I want to talk about is conviction. So just clarifying that, I think you will see that, of course, I think that the humanities produce knowledge, and that acknowledgement, as Cavell says, is a form of knowledge. It just doesn't exist in the register of certainty, he says. So that's just, I mean, so everything else you're saying, I think we agree in. And I think maybe I should just put in a footnote or expand on that opposition between certainty and conviction here.
yeah, I just want to speak for the word of certainty in literary criticism. When he says that I would have to give up everything else that I feel fairly clear about if I were to give up this reading about For Whom the Bell Tolls, that's the kind of standard that gets developed in Wittgenstein's uncertainty, right? That sort of these things hang together. If I were to give this up, what else would I doubt that I have a body and so on?
Well, but how would you, so how would you then distinguish between what you call certainty there and the word conviction, which Cavell emphasizes a lot, the total conviction you have that you're right about this? I mean, your example about Song of Roland and Hemingway illustrates, to my mind, perfectly what I was saying, namely that you can't reason your way to why this is right. There's no philosophical logic in the world that can give you the reason why this is right. You just see it and you are totally convinced. And so that's why I think we are agreeing. And I think you need to specify the difference between certainty and conviction for us to get to a disagreement, as it were.
It's certainly the case that certainty is used in logic. I'm just suggesting that in Cavell's mind and the claim of reason, it's also a term with a different context and practice that gets used in criticism. If I can, just the second point that I want to raise is that and this is intriguing to me, and you're discovering this in Aesthetic Problems, that he actually quotes that passage from the Investigations where he says, you know, if I reach bedrock, spade is turned, and then I'm inclined to say this is simply what I do. You're right that in Aesthetic Problems, he takes that claim to be not, I'm inclined to say this is what I do, but this is what I do, that the critic takes this position of, in the conversation, I'm going to stop with what I see and say, well, this is the ground for what I say. that's another passage in Aesthetic Problems. I think Stanley would feel, you know, you talked about how critics might feel uneasy about things that they then discover are they no longer have conviction. That's something I think he would not feel comfortable with. And I think it's partly because what happens as he moves later on in his thinking about criticism, the focus is more how one, it's also true in the early essays, but a greater emphasis on how I express what I see if I am a critic, right? How I give expression to it, rather than about my position of isolation, which probably is Stanley's position in the 60s, right? So that's all I have to say.
Right. I think I could say more, but I'd like to hear more questions.
So is it my turn now? Or okay, great. Well, it's great to see both of you, Steve and Toril, and to talk about your terrific papers. So obviously you have somewhat overlapping concerns, but you're talking about different media, literature, and film. And so my question is, in essence, what difference do medium-specific considerations make? And I mean, specifically when it comes to questions of acknowledging characters, obviously there's a different set of questions around acknowledging an actor or a character on film than in the case of acknowledging a character in literature, in a work of literary fiction. And even if we get past the kinds of concerns about treating characters as real people that Cavell encourages us to get past in The Avoidance of Love that Toril was talking about. And Cavell, of course, talks about the natural ascendancy of the actor over the character in film versus the natural ascendancy over the character over the actor in theater, something that Stephen was kind of alluding to when he mentioned Cavell's use of the name Cary Grant as opposed to the character's name. There are also interesting exceptions to that. There's a recent article by James McFarland on Cavell and zombie movies, where he notes some interesting exceptions to this rule, as it were, where, for example, Cavell in talking about Jules and Jim in The World Viewed refers to Jules and Jim, but then also refers to Jean Moreau. So interesting questions about the critical insights or judgments that Cavell is making when he refers to someone by the character's name as opposed to the actor's name. But so my general question has to do with medium-specific considerations and how they arise in connection with acknowledging characters. But also, I am interested in connecting that to concerns that I know that I share with Stephen, having to do with the general trajectory in Cavell's thinking around this time and how it bears on film, and some things that Steve was alluding to having to do with how, when or where exactly do these questions about achieving subjectivity or achieving mortality come into Cavell's thinking about film, and how it links up with the emergence of moral perfectionism as a prime notion in Cavell's thinking. And I think we can say that so questions about the cogito, about Descartes and Emerson definitely start to emerge in the 80s. They're definitely in Cavell's writing. They're definitely in the essays in the late 80s that would eventually constitute Contesting Tears, like most famously the essay on Gaslight, talking about the notion of achieving one's voice, and the cogito as it emerges in the Ingrid Bergman's characters, so-called aria at the end of Gaslight. So and the Descartes and Emerson thoughts emerge very clearly there. But one even earlier place in Cavell's writing that connects those concerns about achieving mortality to specific questions about the medium of film is towards the end of what photography calls thinking. And specifically the reading of Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, there where he's talking about the specific character of the specific nature of the camera, to capture the involuntary gestures of persons, to capture features of the unconscious, and that's where he talks about the actors submitting themselves to the camera as a kind of act of achieving subjectivity. So I think that's an important point where Cavell is touching on those themes, but specifically connecting it to questions of the specific medium of film and the nature of the camera. So thanks.
If you like, I can answer very briefly, because the most of this is for Stephen and his great work on the movie. I just want to say, in what I was talking about, hardly anything I say is specific to any art form or genre, because this is about, you know, that fundamental situation in which you meet the work. And there are footnotes in the Lear essay to Michael Fried's art criticism, for example. I think that feeling of having to notice something is totally fundamental. And that's at a level whereby, you know, everything we learn about genre and art form and history of the art form and so on enables us to notice something, but it's not, I think, so in general, everything I say would be true for any kind of criticism, I think. I mean, maybe discover an art form where it wouldn't work. But for example, there's an art form I know nothing about, which is dance, ballet. I see them, but I can't find any words because I haven't got the training. So that to get to the questions of genre, and I see in the chat someone raises the issue of genre and questions and so on, you have to do the training, and what you then see, as it were. See, I think everything I'm saying is based on one thing. How you go about finding out, as Cavell writes, depends on what you want to find out. So that to notice something and find your question is what I spend the first beginning of the paper on. That's the key. And if your question then turns out to be about characters, well, then you do the work on that. Or so to that extent, what I'm saying is not at all in competition with what Stephen is saying. And I'm going to shut up now, except I'm going to say one thing about Only Angels Have Wings, because I was so struck. This is because I think it connects to your question about early and late Cavell in some muddled way. When I watched the movie, well, first of all, I couldn't help thinking it was sexist and somewhat stereotyping about Latin Americans. You know, Jean Arthur calls the Spanish pig Latin. I didn't like that at all. But for me, the most stunning, the thing that I noticed in the film was Cary Grant's, the close-up. It's a very muddled visual film. There's lots of muddled visual scenes. But then you have that close-up of Cary Grant's face as Jane Arthur comes to say goodbye. And that's the point. It's a little later than where Stephen says he gets the insight after the kid's death. But it is his sorrow over the kid that enables him to, I agree with, I would say one could read Stephen's point in the light of, this is the moment where Grant realizes that he must begin to ask someone something. You know, that leitmotif, I wouldn't ask any woman anything, I wouldn't ask anyone to do anything for me. And when he realizes that he needs others, that's what that's about, that he's in pain over the death of the kid. And then Jean Arthur comes and he can't let her go. So the discovery of needing others seems to me to be underpinning the discovery, or connected to what Stephen is talking about the discovery of mortality. But Stephen, over to you.
I saw your note, Victor. I will be.
No, but let me just say one thing for the public. We are running out of time, of course. So this is an experiment, as you know, and so we'll have to rethink about this. But those people that have written their questions in the chat, make sure that I can assure you we're going to send you responses and find some other way in which to continue this dialogue. For the moment, then, Stephen, if you can answer that question. And we have two more people that I would like to call because they've been waiting as well. One is Nancy, Jonadas, and Russell Goodman. I think with those three, we can finish the session. I'm sorry for the rest, but we'll make sure to get back to you, and we'll rethink about the time issue. Please, Stephen.
So again, all of these matters are things, there's lots to talk about. I'm not going to try to give a long answer. I would say to what Toro was just saying, there's a difference between recognizing that you need someone and being willing to commit to someone. The Grant character knows he needs the flyers throughout. He also, it's not as though he's completely unfeeling. He cares about them. It's sad when they die. He's not willing to commit. He's not willing to make a commitment to any of them that's an existential commitment where he now is invested in what happens. That's my sense of things. Again, we could talk about it a lot. Byron, thank you so much. I'm so glad that this is being recorded, because that was a remarkably interesting set of comments that there's a lot I want to think about, and I hope we'll be able to continue talking about. I want to just say one thing that I think is really helpful about what you say about the camera and your reference to Mr. Deeds. So one way I'm thinking about this might be that we might say, and this is an initial thought, that the achievement of mortality for the actor is made automatic by film, because there's something about what film does, what the camera does, that renders them absolutely and utterly specifically them, right? So it reveals the person, and there's no escaping it. That's a power of the camera. So for the film actor, the achievement of mortality is, in a sense, at least as actor, automatic, right? They don't have to worry about it. The camera did it. That doesn't mean the camera did it when they're not on camera, right? But then I don't have any immediate thoughts about difference versus literature or something. But what I do have is an immediate thought about the difference between film and philosophy, which is that, this is my claim about Little Did I Know, it took 517 pages of writing for Cavell to try to achieve his mortality. It's work, and it has a very different kind of structure. I mean, as you know, because you've read my paper, I talk about some of the specific elements of this work, but that in philosophy and in life, this doesn't happen automatically. But you're leading me to think maybe one of the blessings of the camera, and maybe one of its curses, is that it's unescapable. So those are just some initial thoughts, but lots more to think about. So thank you.
Great, thanks. Nancy Bauer, please. Yuri, por favor, Nancy Bauer no puede prender su micrófono.
Los micros están activados para todos.
Yeah. Okay, you can do it. You're on, Nancy.
I don't think you mean me, Victor. There's another Nancy here.
Okay, you're on.
But I don't have a question.
No, you must have a question, Nancy. You have been singled out.
Russell Goodman, then.
Hi, buenos dias a todos. I enjoyed both of these papers very much. I probably want to say some more things about Toro than about Stephen right now, because I'm kind of overwhelmed by all the things he said. I did want to say about Stephen's paper that, and I'll come to this again, the idea of exemplification is really interesting, something you raised. And I've been writing about Emerson and Montaigne recently, and both of those guys exemplify the virtues they're also discussing in the course of their work. And so I was very interested in that. And I've been looking at Little Did I Know previously trying to figure out why Stanley started writing about Walden in the late 60s. And so there's good stuff in there about that. So such a great work to engage with in many respects. So Toril, so you emphasize the word reading in the subtitle of The Avoidance of Love, a reading of King Lear, quite correctly in my view. And this is not a question, but just an observation. In The Philosopher in American Life, I guess it's the first essay in the collected Emersonian works of Cavell. He distinguishes two methods in philosophy. And one of them is called argumentation, something like that. That's what we all learned in graduate school, or we're supposed to. And the other he calls reading. So he uses the word reading in that essay to describe his method as a philosopher. You probably know all this, but I'm just making these connections. I thought the idea of the text versus the tree was really great. And the way to get a text as text, you have to incorporate it. That's one of those obvious things that takes somebody to point out. And I was thinking about, because of that, reading, I've been struggling for a while with what Emerson means by a poem. He called in the Poet, he says the poem is a new creation, it's a new being, it's alive. And I think I can't quote the full definition, but I think the sense of life. So what is the sense of life in a poem? And what is the sense of life in an Emersonian essay, which is also, I think, just a poem in his view. And it has to do with being a reader of it, I think, in part. That's one way in which a poem is alive, by being something that works on or with a reader. A tree doesn't do that. The phone book doesn't do that either, but a poem or an Emersonian essay might. But I also think another way a poem or an Emersonian essay is alive and is just in this idea of exemplification. When Emerson says in Self-Reliance, are they my poor? That's one of the places where he exposes himself. So just that thought. Two other very quick thoughts, maybe I won't even give the second. Let me just tell a story, which again, Toril, you probably know, but if you don't, it's worth thinking about in connection with what's obvious and expertise. So it's a well-known story around Oxford about the former professor of mathematics, W.H. Hardy, in which he's standing at the blackboard going through a proof in his class. And he, line, here you get this. And then he says, oh yeah, the rest is obvious. And then he stops. And he leaves the room. Do you know this, Stephen?
No.
He leaves the room. 10 minutes later, he comes back in and he says, yeah, it was obvious. Or it is obvious, that's it. So make of that story what you want. But it was obvious to him and should have been to his class, but it probably wasn't. It wouldn't have been obvious to me. Final small point, I always am sensitive to ways in which the so-called pragmatists, especially William James, are in some kind of tradition with Stanley Cavell. And so when you were talking about the uneliminability of the subjective, of the person, of the human being, that's something that James talks about in a number of places. And he just says, I can't hide it. What are you going to do? Yes, I come with my biases. I come with my human approaches to things. Sorry, I can't do anything about it. I'll admit it and just deal with it. And so, yeah, it's there with him too. End of commentary stream. Thank you both for your wonderful papers.
Am I supposed to say something? Okay, I'll just say super quickly, since we're running out of time, that yes, the contrast, what you refer to as the two methods, I find that very strongly present in the opening to the Claim of Reason, where Cavell, I think, talks about the difference between seeing philosophy as a set of texts and seeing philosophy as a set of problems. I mean, that's the issue.
Yeah.
And clearly, as a, I think that I think Stephen, I have not said how much I admire Stephen Affeld's work, and I am delighted to be on the same session as he. But Stephen said to me in an email exchange that what I'm saying about reading, therefore, is also true about reading philosophy. Of course, if you see philosophy as reading texts, then obviously. And the last thing I'm going to say is there is an element that I would love to work on more. Our great predecessor in all this is Nancy Bauer. Nancy Bauer picked up from, having studied with Cavell, she writes a book on Simone de Beauvoir. I feel, and this would be too long a conversation to go into, but I feel that everything Stephen says more or less about acknowledging or, facing one's mortality, shouldering existence, making your life meaningful and all this, it's all Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre as well. And I think that there's so much to be said in drawing the parallels. I'm not saying direct influences, but parallels and preoccupations between the French existentialist and Cavell and ordinary language philosophy. And I wish we should have a whole seminar series on that. So that's because it's so striking. This is where I'm sort of seeing something and I want to work it out. And the final point is that I think everything I said about how we read and so on is dependent on the idea that you must notice something and then you must be able to ask a question. It's not just describing the work. Too much literary criticism, in my opinion, takes the form of, I want to write an essay on X. Well, why? What drives you is then there's got to be something that you really want to find out, or it's not going to be very interesting. So that's that thing about having a problem that confuses you is as important as being able to notice something. And it's so hard to do either. It's just difficult. Anyway, final word.
Thank you, Toro. Stephen.
I want to say something quickly. Russell, first of all, it's great to see you. I mean, it's thousands of miles away, but it's one of the great things that we can see. I can see your face. And Nancy, it's always great to see you. And I completely agree with Toril. So Russell, here's a thing for us to keep thinking about, because this is if I have a disagreement with anything Toril said, it's around this point. I don't think that subjectivity can be taken for granted. So when you say, that's in James too, what I want to emphasize here is, we've had this conversation lots, but here's another place to pick it up. What's the difference between pragmatists and Emerson and Thoreau? James might well think, of course, I have my subjectivity. I bring it to bear. I can't get away from it. Here it is. And someone like Emerson and Thoreau, what they're always asking themselves is this, do I have any subjectivity? Or am I just quoting the thoughts of those who came before us? Am I, is there an I here who is speaking? Am I being self-reliant? Or am I just serving as a kind of conduit for the conformist attitudes of my culture, which of course are still influencing and informing how I view everything, right? So it's not as though the opposite of having achieved your subjectivity is a neutral, objective point of view. The opposite is, Cavell's terms are sort of anonymous, fraudulent, where there's somebody's voice speaking, but it's not your voice, right? It's not your subjectivity. And that's something that again, I think it's a nice place for us to consider, again, these questions about the relationship between the pragmatist, the transcendentalist, Cavell's perfectionism. So I
agree. I think that would be a great thing to talk about. I think I've been muted, so
no, you're not muted.
I'm not. Okay, yeah, no, I think James in that moment where he says that, he does not regard his own subjectivity as a problem, and he's probably overconfident. And I think that is maybe something about pragmatism and its attitude that Stanley doesn't like. And that's worth, I mean, one of the questions is, why doesn't Stanley like pragmatism? And some of it has to do with Emerson, but some of it has to do with this as well. But I do remember Hilary Putnam saying somewhere that James is a religious existentialist. And so we'd want to look at that also.
Yeah, well, and there's certainly places in James, you know, that express a lot more of this kind of wonder about the self and so on.
Yeah, maybe more in varieties of religious experience than in the pragmatism book. Yes, yeah.
Well, I'm sorry to be the party pooper here. I mean, we should stay for another hour. It is obvious. We will see what to do. I want to apologize to Tom Arnold and Nancy Youssef and Tony Nix, who have been participating in the chat, and we haven't gotten to it. We are a little bit short of time today. We have a technical limitation as well. So, but I can assure you, I will distribute these questions to the speakers, and we will continue this conversation in one way or another. And fortunately, we will solve these problems for the next time. The next time is in next month. And Juliet Nicholas Toivokainen, together with Jonatas Tekio, will be presenting their papers. I encourage you to go into the page, the web page, where we have the events, and I hope to see you there. Thank you very much for your patience, and thank you to the speakers. Wonderful talks. We will continue talking.
Thank you, Victor.
Take care.
Thanks, Victor.
Good to see you.
See you all.